The Langmore's ballroom had that curated kind of elegance you only find in historic hotels where the crown molding doesn't pretend and the chandeliers hang like they've seen things. It was warm inside, both from the lighting and the weight of formality. Waitstaff in black ties glided between tables like clockwork, and a string quartet played a classical arrangement of an old Coldplay song, the kind only people who donate to museums would recognize. It was the 45th anniversary of my parents' marriage. Douglas and Claudia Hanford, retired colonel and longtime DAR board member, respectively. The event was invitation-only catered and meticulously assigned by table. I was seated at the far end of the family's main table between a cousin I barely knew and an empty seat someone had the sense not to fill. I hadn't been to a Hanford event in over 8 years. No holidays, no birthdays, no phone calls that lasted more than 3 minutes. But the invitation came in a cream-colored envelope hand-addressed by my mother. No email, no text, just a line of ink that said, "We hope to see you, Morel." It wasn't an olive branch, but it was something. And after what I'd just finalized that month, I decided I'd go. I chose my dress carefully. Navy blue high neckline, elegant but quiet. I wore my hair down, no jewelry but the pearl studs my grandmother gave me when I turned 16. I didn't want to be flashy. I didn't need to prove anything. I just wanted to be seen. The food arrived in courses: fig salad, beef medallions, then some kind of bruleed pear tart that looked more like a sculpture than dessert. Gavin, my older brother, talked loudly about his latest defense consultancy contract, dropping names like they were Garnish, Pentagon, Raytheon, Blackwell Group. His wife nodded politely, clearly rehearsed in his cadence. My mother interrupted only to offer details about his recent promotion. My name hadn't been mentioned once. I kept glancing at the small folder in my clutch. Inside was a letter, an announcement. Something I'd worked toward for years. I wasn't expecting applause or a toast. Just a moment. A little space at the table that was supposed to belong to all of us. When the dessert plates were placed, I reached for my water glass and tapped it lightly with my spoon. The sound rang out gently but firm enough to turn a few heads. "If I could," I said, rising to my feet, "I'd like to share something quickly before the evening winds down." My mother froze her fork mid-air. My brother's smirk returned like muscle memory. And my father, he didn't even turn his head at first. He just set his napkin down and slowly stood up. "No," he said. I blinked. I'm sorry. You don't get to speak here," he said, his voice low but forceful. "Not tonight. Not at my table. You made your choice when you walked out that door and refused your appointment." The room had begun to hush. A few people paused their cutting. The string quartet, perhaps sensing the shift, faded out mid-phrase. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds," I said calmly. "I just wanted to share something I'm proud of. Something I thought You thought wrong," he snapped, stepping fully into the aisle. "You are not a soldier. You're not a Hanford. You chose your path, your silly buildings, and eco-something consulting. But don't think you get to step back in here and act like family." Silence swept across the table. His face didn't show anger. It showed certainty. "Leave now," he said, eyes fixed on me. "You're dead to me." It wasn't a yell. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, clean, practiced. And then he turned to the waiter who'd just approached with a tray of coffee cups and said coldly, "Clear her plate," like she never existed. The clink of a fork dropping 2 tables away felt like thunder. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I looked once at my mother. She stared at her napkin like it was the only way to keep herself from unraveling. Gavin bit the inside of his cheek like someone holding back laughter. I sat down, slowly folded my napkin, set it carefully on top of the untouched dessert, and I stood again, taller this time. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The sounds of silverware and soft music resumed behind me like nothing had happened at all. Outside, the summer air of Savannah wrapped around me, thick and unbothered. The Langmore's brass-plated door shut behind me with a finality that felt earned. I walked across the circular driveway, heels echoing against the stone. I paused under the arched entrance, looking up at the hand-painted name above the doors, the Langmore Hotel. Est, 1889. The same hotel my father had dreamed of buying into someday. The one he once said was a Southern legacy done right. He had no idea. My name is Dr. Morel Hanford. I'm 31 years old. I'm a structural engineer. I specialize in rehabilitating historic hotels and designing high-performance systems for luxury properties across the country. My firm, Craft Habitat, holds over a dozen patent services clients in 5 states and employs more than 40 engineers. And the Langmore. I already own 60% of it. Next week, I close on the rest. I was raised in a house where discipline echoed louder than affection, and silence was often considered a virtue. In Charleston, South Carolina, tradition isn't just remembered, it's curated, lacquered, and displayed like heirlooms in glass cabinets. My childhood home sat 2 blocks from the Battery, a white-columned colonial revival with black shutters and a flagpole taller than the roofline. My father, Colonel Douglas Hanford, never missed a morning raising that flag at precisely 0600. Even after retirement, he timed it with a stopwatch. Precision, he said, was not just military, it was moral. Inside the house, there were no closed doors during the day. We were taught that privacy was a privilege, not a right. My mother kept the floors waxed and the curtains perfectly matched to the season. She ran the home like a private academy down to the seating charts at holiday dinners and the quarterly academic performance reviews, taped to the inside of our kitchen cabinets. Every object had a place. Every moment had a purpose. Gavin, my older brother, by 4 years, thrived under that structure. By 8, he was quoting Eisenhower. By 12, he was already being courted by prep schools with military programs. He liked ranks routines, the pride in my father's eyes. I, on the other hand, liked sketching floor plans of tree houses. I once designed a rainwater collection system on the back of a church bulletin and taped it to the kitchen fridge. My father removed it before dinner. I was 7 the first time I said I wanted to be an architect. I'd watched a documentary at school on how sustainable buildings could change the way cities lived and breathed. That night, I sat up at the dinner table and said clearly, I think I want to build things. Real things. My father didn't even look up from his roast beef. He just said, "What kind of things?" I replied. "Buildings, maybe hotels, places that last." He scoffed, took a sip of water, and said, "Soft nonsense. Build something that matters." From that moment, a kind of quiet started growing between us. It wasn't angry or loud, it was institutional, controlled. He stopped asking me about my interests, and I stopped offering. My mother tried to redirect me, at first signing me up for debate club, gently suggesting I join Gavin at the Air and Space STEM camp in Maryland. I went. I hated it. When we visited West Point this summer, I turned 15, she handed me the admissions brochure on the drive back like it was a birthright. I remember holding it in my lap the entire ride, staring at the photo of a girl in uniform saluting on the front cover. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Maybe that was the point. Junior year of high school came with application season. Gavin had already shipped off to Annapolis by then. My father assumed I'd follow suit. "We'll begin your paperwork for the Naval Academy and the Citadel," he told me one afternoon as we sat in the sunroom, the light hitting his brass cufflinks like little warning flares. "You've got the scores. All we need is commitment." I looked at him and said as clearly as I could, "I'm not applying. I want to study architectural engineering, civilian, at Purdue." He stared at me for a full 10 seconds, not blinking, not breathing, almost. Then he said one word, "No." It wasn't a question, it wasn't even a command, it was a diagnosis. What followed wasn't an argument, it was a withdrawal. No shouting, no slammed doors, just silence. My college counselor received a call from my father the next morning letting him know I'd be redirecting my interests. I reasserted myself. My applications went out anyway. Berkeley, Purdue, Georgia Tech. I got in. Full ride. Dean's honors. But there were no banners, no framed letters, no congratulatory dinner. Just a man at the head of a table who didn't look up when I said I was leaving in August. At orientation, the dean asked us to share why we'd chosen our path. I said, "Because buildings stay standing longer than memory." He chuckled. I didn't. For years, I tried to pretend that upbringing didn't shape me, that I'd built my discipline on my own, carved it out of grit and caffeine and deadlines. But the truth is, Structure was bred into me, not affection, not praise, but structure. And structure, ironically, was what made me excellent. I knew how to deliver results under pressure. I knew how to build something that didn't need approval to be called real. Still, there's a difference between using steel and being forged in it. Some things leave marks, and in my case, one of those marks was a long, quiet hallway in a Charleston home where obedience hung heavier than the family portraits. It took me years to realize they hadn't raised me to be exceptional. They'd raised me to comply, and the moment I didn't, I became invisible. I moved out 3 weeks after high school graduation. There was no going-away dinner, no trunk packed by the front door, no group photo on the porch. I loaded everything I owned, 2 duffel bags, a set of rolled blueprints, and my refurbished laptop into the back of a classmate's old Subaru. The studio I was moving into wasn't much a converted garage behind the home of Ms. Jensen, my high school art teacher. She'd offered it after seeing me work alone in the library one afternoon drafting floor plans on scrap printer paper. "You need your own space," she said, her voice calm as if offering me sanctuary instead of subletting an 11 by 18 cement box with a hot plate and a leaking skylight. It was perfect. The walls were unfinished drywall still dotted with old nail holes and water stains. The only furniture was a collapsible cot, a broken dresser missing a leg, and a fold-out desk salvaged from the school's drama department. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, there were no inspections, no 0600 wake-ups, no expectations posted on the fridge, just quiet. And an open outlet for my laptop. Purdue was 10 hours away, and I spent the summer working double shifts at a home improvement store to pay for the Greyhound ticket and supplies. I received a full scholarship merit-based renewable with a small stipend for materials. My father never acknowledged the news. He didn't ask which school I chose. He didn't ask if I arrived safely. He didn't ask anything at all. My mother called once in September. She told me to email her my address so she could send vitamins. I never got the package. At Purdue, I lived like someone afraid of wasting time. I took 18 credits each semester, audited 2 additional courses, and spent nights working in the structural lab helping graduate students test load-bearing materials. I had no car, no family nearby, no backup. But I had systems, I had spreadsheets, I had a calendar color-coded to within an inch of its life. Every semester, I made the dean's list. Every summer, I applied for grants to attend conferences in Chicago, Denver, Albuquerque, anywhere I could meet architects and engineers working on the fringes of sustainable hospitality. It was at one of those workshops in Colorado where I met Julian Fang, a soft-spoken project lead from a boutique design firm. We ended up talking over boxed lunches in the corner of a half-empty exhibition room. I told him I was interested in transitional spaces, how light material and airflow could impact how people moved through a building. He asked for samples. I sent him PDFs the next day. 2 weeks later, he sent me a file back, an RFP for a 6-room eco-lodge in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. They can't pay much, he warned, but they're open to fresh eyes. I didn't hesitate. I spent every spare hour for the next 2 weeks drafting proposals, revising specs, and learning every possible local code I could find. I submitted the final plan at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday and fell asleep with my head on my keyboard. They chose my design. The pay was modest, just enough to cover groceries and a used monitor I picked up from a pawn shop, but the project was mine. I watched the lodge take form from 1,000 miles away, receiving progress photos and notes from the site crew. It was small, built with reclaimed pine local stone and a rainwater system I'd modeled using an open-source calculator, but it stood. And people stayed there. People touched things I'd imagined into existence. That first lodge led to another project this time, a retrofit of a vintage motel near Glenwood Springs, then another, a 4-cabin expansion in Durango. Slowly, quietly, a network began to form. My name started appearing in local architecture blogs, then small trade publications. I bought my first set of business cards, plain white, with my name, degree in progress, and email. I never added my phone number. I wasn't ready for that level of exposure. Back home, the silence became a second skin. At first, I still called during holidays, left voicemails that ended in awkward pauses. But after the third Thanksgiving without a return call, I stopped trying. Christmas cards were returned unopened. My mother sent one text after I posted a photo on LinkedIn of a panel I spoke at in Denver. It said, "You always looked nice in blazers." That was it. Gavin never reached out. He made sure I was tagged in every family photo posted online, though weddings, baby showers, graduation parties for nieces I'd never met. My name was never in the caption. Then one afternoon during my final semester, I received an email from my father. The subject line read, "Hanford." No greeting, no punctuation, just a single sentence. "Let me know when you come to your senses." I didn't reply. I remember staring at the screen for a long time, rereading the line until the letters blurred. I wasn't angry, not surprised, just tired. Tired of waiting for someone to see me outside the shape they had carved for me. Tired of being reminded that love in my family was conditional, earned only by submission to someone else's vision. So I deleted the email. Then I opened a blank document. On the top line, I typed, "Hanford isn't a legacy, it's a launch pad." Then I went back to work. I didn't cry on the way home. Not in the elevator, not in the car, not even when the valet closed the door gently like he knew. I drove with the windows down, letting the thick Savannah night press in through the silence. The city was soft around the edges that time of evening shop lights, dimming Spanish moss hanging low like a curtain drawn over the day. I didn't turn on music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove until I saw the familiar curve of my street and the small flicker of the porch light I always forget to turn off. The house I lived in wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. A 2-story craftsman tucked into the edge of a tree-lined district with cedar siding and a porch swing that creaked when the wind was restless. I hadn't built it. I hadn't even renovated it. But I chose it because of the windows tall, wide, and facing east. The kind of windows that didn't try to hide anything. I kicked off my shoes by the front door, peeled off the blazer I had worn like armor all evening, and walked barefoot into my office. It wasn't much a converted guest room with matte black bookshelves, a teak desk, and a framed photograph on the wall. It showed a group of engineers standing on scaffolding during a build in Marfa, Texas. One of them had a pencil behind her ear and a smudge of paint on her cheek. That one was me. In the back corner of the closet, hidden behind a stack of sample swatches and old rolled-up site maps, was a small gunmetal safe. No one knew it was there except me and the locksmith who installed it. I turned. The dial listened for the familiar clicks and pulled open the door. Inside was a single black folder, the kind made of heavyweight linen stock, no label, no markings, just weight, memory, and power. I laid it flat on the desk, opened it slowly, and ran my fingers over the documents like I was tracing old scars. There were contracts, each one signed through an entity named Harlan Group Holdings, LLC. A parent company incorporated discreetly out of Wilmington, Delaware, managed by a small team of legal counsel and trust advisors who understood discretion better than most families understood inheritance. Harlan Group wasn't just a shell, it was a shield. And it was named after the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was already enough. My grandfather, Harlan Hanford, had been a quiet man. A widower by the time I was born, a retired civil engineer who taught himself carpentry after retirement, because he said hands shouldn't go idle just because the phone stops ringing. When I was a kid, he let me help him rebuild a pergola in his backyard, taught me how to read a spirit level and stain wood evenly without blotching. He never commented on the trophies Gavin brought home, never compared us. He just handed me a blueprint once and said, "Nothing wrong with building your own foundation, kid. Just make sure it's level." He died when I was 17. I didn't get to say goodbye. So when it came time to name the holding company that would discreetly acquire shares of the Langmore over a 4-year period shares that had been slowly offloaded by a flailing hospitality conglomerate, I didn't hesitate. Harlan Group was my silent partner. The first stake was small, just 11% purchased quietly through a third-round equity offering during a reorganization. No one noticed. Then, 17% from a divorce settlement sale. Another 22% through a silent bid after a co-owner's death. It took patience, lawyers, and an emotional stillness I'd cultivated for years. But it was clean, legal, and nearly complete. The final 10%, the portion that would give me control over board decisions and operations, was set to close in 7 days. 7. It was a strange thing knowing you were about to own the very ground that had tried to swallow you whole, not just as a customer or contractor, but as the person who would sign the staff paychecks, approve renovation budgets, choose the drapes, and decide whether the ballroom stayed or got turned into a second-level event atrium with better acoustics and natural light. My father didn't know, of course. He hadn't been involved in the hotel's operations in years, not since his informal bid to join the board had been declined in 2016. I remember the article in the local business journal, Former Colonel Outbid in Landmark Hotel Restructure. He'd blamed investors, said the hotel had lost its values. But the truth was simpler. He had no leverage. I did. I closed the folder, placed it back in the safe, and locked it without ceremony. Then I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the dark street beyond, listening to the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the porch swing swaying in the night breeze. Next week I would own the Langmore. Tonight I let that truth settle into my bones, quiet and heavy and certain. Not as revenge, not even as justice, just as proof. I hadn't vanished. I'd arrived. There was never a grand opening for Craft Habitat. No ribbon cutting, no launch party, no press release. Just me. An old MacBook and a folding table set up in a one-bedroom rental in Fort Collins with a leaky bathroom and paper-thin walls. I registered the LLC on a Tuesday night between grading final capstone papers and troubleshooting a client's plumbing schematic that had been drawn by someone who clearly thought water flowed uphill. I'd been working full-time for a regional architecture firm at the time, mostly tucked behind CAD stations, drawing up plans for suburban office parks and chain hotels. The pay was steady, but the work, it felt hollow, disconnected from anything that breathed. I kept asking if we could pitch small-scale green retrofits or consider more low-impact materials for projects in wildfire zones. And every time I was told the same thing, not on this budget. So I stopped asking. Craft Habitat started quietly. My first job under that name was a redesign of a 6-room lodge outside of Boise owned by 2 sisters in their 60s who made soaps from goat milk and honey. They'd saved for years to restore the cabins, but every contractor they'd hired either overcharged or ghosted them. I charged just enough to cover my own expenses, worked nights and weekends to finish the job, and ended up sleeping on site in one of the unheated rooms with a space heater that smelled like burnt toast. But I got it done. And when the first guests checked in, I cried in the back office where no one could see me. Word spread the way it often does for people like us quietly through people who'd been ignored or underestimated one too many times. I got referrals from ceramicists, bookstore owners, chefs running bakeries out of church kitchens. They didn't have big budgets, but they had big hearts. They wanted their spaces to last, to function, to welcome. I helped them design rain capture systems, passive cooling loops, and radiant floor heating that wouldn't bankrupt their operations. Some nights I slept 3 hours. Some months I earned less than minimum wage. But the work was mine, and that mattered more than anything. Support came in unexpected ways. Women in the field, mostly quiet emails of encouragement from engineers I'd met at niche conferences, introductions to suppliers who wouldn't try to overcharge me just because I was young or female or operating out of a garage. One woman, Elena Caro, a mechanical systems lead from Chicago, sent me her own heat load calculation templates when mine kept throwing errors. "Don't let bad software waste your time," she wrote. "Your brain's too good for that. We still talk every other week. By year 2, I had a contractor on retainer, a part-time virtual assistant, and 3 clients in Colorado, 2 in Arizona, and 1 unexpectedly in Georgia. The Georgia project came through a procurement portal. It looked like a standard RFP historic building, low efficiency systems, high tourist traffic. The name caught my eye immediately. The Langmore Hotel Savannah. I clicked, blinked, then clicked again. I knew that name like, you know the smell of your childhood church pew. That hotel had been my father's dream property. He'd visited it every year with the Historical Hospitality Society, spoken of it with the kind of reverence some men reserve for battlefields. Now that he once said over Thanksgiving dinner is how you preserve legacy, the Langmore doesn't compromise. I remembered how my mother nodded like it was scripture. I submitted a proposal under an alias brand I had created for just this kind of situation, Habitat Technical Services. Separate email domain, separate mailing address, just as clean on paper. They awarded me the contract. No one asked for a Zoom call. Everything was handled via deliverables and digital correspondence. I designed a complete HVAC overhaul, mapped a dual-loop geothermal support line, and retrofitted the entire water distribution system to reduce waste by over 40%. I never stepped foot inside the building during implementation. It wasn't necessary. I knew every inch of it by blueprint. The system was installed in phases over the course of 7 months. I watched construction photos come in like postcards from a place I wasn't allowed to return to. When the ribbon cutting happened, I didn't attend. But I saw the photos. My father had been there. In the local paper, he stood in the second row wearing his navy blazer and striped tie, smiling politely behind the hotel's co-owners as they held the ceremonial scissors. The caption called him a longtime supporter of Savannah preservation efforts. Later that night, I found a clip online, a short interview. A reporter asked him what he thought of the renovations. He replied, "Impressive work, solid upgrades. It's good to see a team that knows what they're doing." He said it with a nod like a man who thought he understood what he was complimenting. He didn't know that team had been me. He never asked. He never would. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the weight of that moment sink in. Not as triumph, not even as irony, just as fact. I had already stood inside that legacy. I had built its lungs, its bones, its unseen circulatory system that would keep it functioning for decades. He had walked its halls, breathed its air, and never once suspected that his daughter had laid its foundation beneath his feet. That was the thing about building in silence. The structures lasted whether or not your name was on the plaque. It started with a spreadsheet. I wasn't looking for it. I'd been reviewing grant allocations for a regional health equity initiative through one of Craft Habitat's community programs. A side project I supported quietly, mostly funding insulation upgrades and indoor air improvements for clinics in underserved areas. The application queue was long, that quarter more than 100 requests. Most were from community centers, school districts, small-town clinics. But then I saw it, Hanford Claudia. It was a line item tucked between 2 other rows requesting a subsidy for long-term specialty medication support. Hospital Memorial Medical Charleston. Diagnosis early-stage Parkinson's. My fingers hovered over the mouse. I double-checked the metadata, then clicked the application open. Her address was still the same Monroe Street, the house with the magnolia tree I used to climb before I knew better. The request wasn't written by her, though. It had come through a caseworker. Attached was a note from her primary neurologist confirming the diagnosis, outlining the recommended treatment path, and the medication that, while promising, wasn't fully covered by their insurance provider. The cost, roughly $1,700 a month. No automatic approvals, no family-sourced backup noted. My stomach knotted in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stared at the screen, blinking, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. No anger, no vindication. Just a deep, heavy pause. They hadn't called. Not even once. Not my mother, not my father, not Gavin. No one had reached out to say her hands were shaking now, that sometimes she struggled with buttons, that her gait had changed, that the woman who once ran every school PTA like a military unit now needed help opening prescription bottles. They hadn't asked me for anything, but that didn't mean they weren't hoping someone would appear. And so I did. Quietly, carefully. That same afternoon, I called Robert Materati, my longtime attorney and trust advisor. We'd worked together for 6 years, and he never asked unnecessary questions. I told him to establish a subgrant under the Harlan Fund, the nonprofit arm I'd set up to funnel education and healthcare support to communities in transition. We'd used it before for a flood recovery program in Tennessee and a low-income housing project outside Sacramento. But this time, I told him to mask the entity trail a little more. It needed to look like a philanthropic education group had adopted Claudia and Douglas Hanford's case, as part of a legacy educator wellness initiative. It was believable and entirely fabricated. Within 3 weeks, the first payment was made directly to the pharmacy's specialty provider. A confirmation letter was mailed from a P.O. box in Maryland with a generic but grateful note. I approved it myself. It ended with the line, "Your years of service to education and civic development have not gone unnoticed." The second blow came just a month later. Robert called me unexpectedly on a Thursday morning. "Did you know your father's VA pension got flagged for review?" he asked. I paused, caught off guard. "No," I said, slowly. How would I know that Robert hesitated, then forwarded a public service bulletin that had been making its way through some federal circles? It listed nearly 200 former officers whose disbursements were under audit due to a procedural conflict tied to retirement codes. Among them, Douglas Hanford. He would still receive temporary funds, but at a reduced rate. And depending on the findings, some could be clawed back. Robert had worked with similar cases before and said the process could take months, sometimes more than a year. Again, I heard nothing from them. No calls, no emails, no backdoor messages through extended cousins. But I did hear one thing through my mother's bridge partner whose daughter attended a charity auction I had anonymously sponsored. The woman mentioned offhandedly that Claudia had seemed stressed about money lately and that Douglas was quieter than usual, which in their world meant something was crumbling beneath the surface. So I moved quietly again. Through a separate shell company, Bright Bridge Consulting, one of several vehicles I kept for sensitive or legacy-facing work, I drafted a contract. It stated that Douglas Hanford had been selected as a civic education advisor for a nationwide curriculum research project. His task, draft a 40-page white paper on leadership frameworks in public education. The stipend, $2,000 per month. The deadline, flexible? I emailed the contract from an anonymous admin account. 3 days later, it came back signed. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I wanted to see the signature again. To be sure it was real. To be sure that he had agreed knowingly or not to accept help from a stranger who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he used to think of her. He never asked who had hired him. Never questioned the vague scope or loose deadlines. But 2 months in, I heard through another whisper in Charleston that he'd been telling neighbors he'd been brought on as a consultant for a state-level education initiative. "Still got it," he reportedly said, grinning at the brunch table. And maybe he did, or maybe I did. Either way, the bills got paid, the medication arrived on time, and the narrative stayed intact. They didn't need to know where the support came from. But I knew. And I wasn't doing it for gratitude. I wasn't even doing it for them. I was doing it because even when the bridge was burnt and the smoke had settled, I still remembered the floor plans of the house I was once forced to leave. I just couldn't bear to see it collapse. It was still early when I pulled into the backlot of the Langmore. The morning light hadn't yet stretched over the full expanse of the building, and the heavy oak trees that lined Whitaker Street cast long, curved shadows along the stonework. The place looked exactly as it always had, dignified, stoic, almost unaware of its own beauty. But I saw something else in its windows now, something quieter, familiar, like seeing your own handwriting in a stranger's journal. I hadn't come to make a statement, not yet. That would come in time, 7 days to be exact, but I needed to walk the floors again, to remind myself of what I'd built before the papers were signed and the legacy made visible. Inside the front desk, staff was mid-shift transition. A young woman name tag read. Aubrey glanced up and offered a practiced smile. She didn't recognize me. That was fine. I gave her a slight nod and murmured something about touring the system installation points for a client reference. It wasn't a lie, just not the full truth. I moved through the lobby past the oil paintings of long-gone colonels and philanthropists toward the service corridor behind the ballroom kitchen. The scent of lemon polish and warm metal was exactly the same. And then I saw her, Mrs. Greer, head housekeeper queen of the back halls. She'd been there forever or so, it felt. I remembered her from the renovation days, always carrying 2 sets of keys and a quiet sense of what everyone needed before they knew it themselves. She looked up from a cart stacked with fresh linens, narrowed her eyes for a second, Then broke into a smile that lifted something behind my ribs. "Well, if it isn't Miss Fix-It herself," she said, her voice a soft gravel worn smooth by decades of early mornings and quiet dignity. "I didn't expect that. You remember me?" I asked, surprised. She chuckled. "I remember the ones who respect the work. You were the only one who looked me in the eye like we built this together." I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "You did build it," I said. She shrugged, almost embarrassed, then gestured to the nearby stairwell. "Boiler room still runs like a dream. Your system's aging better than most of the owners." Her eyes glinted. We walked together for a few minutes past the laundry drop, the service elevators, the storage closets I once mapped out wire by wire. I asked about the staff turnover, only moderate, she said. A few new faces, a few retirements, the core still held. Before we parted ways, she paused, then added quietly, "Whatever you're doing, thank you. This place needs someone who cares more about the bones than the brochures." After she left, I walked alone to the second-floor conference wing. I slipped into one of the unused rooms and pulled out the tube I'd brought, an old blueprint, one of the originals from the retrofitting project. I laid it out on the table, tracing the lines with my fingertips. The ductwork, the weight-bearing joists, the custom return air vents I had redesigned myself after noticing a flaw in the original draft. Every inch of it still lived in my memory. The Langmore had always been more than just a building. It was a kind of inheritance no one had offered me, so I'd claimed it another way. Through labor, through systems, through the invisible choices that made everything feel seamless for the guests who came and went. I sat down, pulled out a pen, and began annotating, half from instinct, half from memory. I noted where I'd add soundproofing between the upper suites. I circled a hallway corner where airflow often lagged during peak occupancy, and in the margin I scribbled 2 words, "Legacy Lives." It wasn't about vengeance. Not really. It was about ownership, the kind that isn't handed down but carved out with sleepless nights, quiet courage, and long, thankless hours. Outside, the sun had shifted higher, casting the facade of the hotel in bright, unapologetic light. I rolled up the blueprint, stood, and walked slowly back through the hallway. No one stopped me. No one questioned why I was there, but soon they would. And when they did, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or explain myself. The building would speak for me. The documents arrived at 7:42 a.m., 3 sleek leather folders couriered by hand from the firm in Atlanta. The morning air was still cool sharp with salt from the river, and the low sun slanted across my windows as I unlatched the envelope. My hands didn't shake. I'd been waiting for this too long, through years of erasure, of whispered dismissal, of being spoken about as if I'd vanished entirely. One by one I signed them. Legalese lined every page, the sort that took weeks to draft and seconds to make permanent. With my signature, the final 20% of the Langmore changed hands. I already controlled 60. The rest had belonged to a silent partner who never cared about the soul of the place. Now, with the stroke of a pen, that legacy belonged to me, quietly, contractually, irrevocably. I didn't announce it. Not yet. The press release that went out that afternoon was under the name of the parent trust, Harlan Development and Legacy Properties. Clean, vague, safe. Just another acquisition in a long list of Southern heritage restorations, the kind real estate columns cover with polite indifference. My name appeared nowhere, but it didn't need to. Not yet. I didn't even tell the staff, though Mrs. Greer probably knew. She always knew. There would be a formal meeting next week once the ink had settled, once the first payroll rolled in under the new banner. Today wasn't about them. It wasn't even about my father, though he would feel it eventually. Today was for me, for what had been taken, and what I'd rebuilt. I parked in the staff lot again, habit, I guess. No need to flaunt. I walked around the side of the building, past the maintenance bay, under the curved iron trellis I'd redesigned from the original blueprints. Guests were filtering out of the breakfast service, their arms full of maps and umbrellas and linen blend hats. They didn't look twice at me. A woman in dark jeans and a blazer, no badge, no clipboard, invisible in all the right ways. The ballroom was empty. It always felt strange to see it that way, silent, stripped of its layers. No music, no chatter, just the gleam of parquet floors and the echoes of things unsaid. I stepped inside and let the door shut behind me. The table was still there. the one I'd been forced to leave. The place settings had changed, but the bones were the same: mahogany runners, heavy-legged chairs, the overhead chandelier like a frozen thunderstorm. I walked its length, slowly pausing at the seat at the head. I sat down. It was the same chair my father had occupied when he looked at me and spat, "You're dead to me." The same one he'd leaned back in when he told the waiter to clear her plate like she never existed. And the same one I had stared at, stunned, as the staff swept away my untouched food, my name card, my dignity. I rested my palms on the table now. The wood was smooth cool. This time, no one stood behind me to usher me out. No eyes averted, no gasps. Just the stillness of a space, finally reclaimed. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small folder, a single-page printout. It was the property deed amended that morning. Owner, Harlan Development and Legacy Properties. Managing partner, Dr. Morel Hanford. I laid it in front of me, not as a trophy, as a reminder. The ballroom hadn't changed, but I had. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the silence settle. Then I whispered, barely audible to the empty room, I cleared the plate myself this time. And I had. I'd cleared the plate of expectation, of smallness, of the version of me they kept trying to serve back to me with a silver lid and a forced smile. I'd cleared the place they gave me at the table, conditional, temporary, one wrong word away from collapse. And now, the table belonged to me. The chandelier creaked slightly overhead as the air system clicked on. I could hear it, the subtle thrum of the HVAC system I'd helped redesign under another firm's name years ago. It still worked, flawlessly, unseen, unthanked, but essential. Just like me. Eventually, I stood, smoothed the blazer, tucked the deed back into the folder. There was still more to do. I hadn't decided yet how or when I'd make the announcement. Whether I'd use my name publicly or let the ownership stay ghostwritten. There was power in restraint, but there was also something deeply satisfying in letting truth bloom in its own time. I left the ballroom the same way I'd entered, quietly. But this time, I didn't walk away ashamed. This time, the walls remembered me, the beams, the ducts, the bones of the place they'd always known. And now, finally, so did the deed. The invitation was printed on heavy cream cardstock embossed with the Langmore's crest. The wording was formal, almost sterile, exactly what I intended. No emotion, no confrontation, just an invitation to a private consultation regarding institutional heritage and leadership transition. I signed it with the initials MH, not that he'd need the name to know who it came from. I sent it to his home address. I knew he'd read it, knew he'd show up. He always responded to formality more than sentiment. It was a Tuesday morning when he arrived 15 minutes early in a pressed gray suit and spit-shined shoes. My father never entered a room unsure of himself. Not until today. I met him in the private conference room off the east wing, the one used for executive luncheons and discreet deals. It was quiet, elegant, overlooking the manicured side garden. I was already seated when he walked in, a black leather folder resting in front of me. I didn't stand. He looked around with practiced inspection eyes, scanning the trim, the crown, molding the floral arrangement in the corner. Then his gaze landed on me, narrowing just slightly. "Morel," he said, voice measured. "What's this about?" I gestured to the chair opposite mine. "Please, sit." He did, warily. "I wanted to give you something," I said, sliding the folder across the table. "No speeches, no scenes." He opened it, hands steady at first. The first page, the property deed. Second breakdown of the investment trail shell. Entities, silent partners, quarterly purchase orders. Third, contracts, closing documents, and finally a notarized certificate of majority ownership signed that morning. By the fifth page, I saw it. The tremor. A slight hitch in his breath. His jaw tensed, but the crease between his brows wasn't anger. It was disbelief. He looked up. "You're not capable of this." I didn't flinch. But I already did it. He stared at me, and for a moment I saw the flicker of the man who had once towered over me at the kitchen table, telling me that architecture was for dreamers and idealists, and that if I didn't straighten up, I'd be just another dropout, trying to fix the world with pretty buildings. I let the silence stretch between us like wire pulled taut. I don't understand, he said finally. Why this hotel? I leaned back slightly. You threw me out of that ballroom, told the waiter to clear my plate like I never existed. I thought, why not own the room next time? He looked down at the pages again, trying to reorient, trying to reconcile the narrative he'd kept for years that I was soft, unfocused, unfit with the reality staring back at him in black and white. I always knew you had potential, he said slowly like the words hurt. No, I replied. You knew how to command, not how to listen. He blinked. This is spite. No, I said, voice low. This is structure, which, ironically, I thought you'd respect. He closed the folder and pushed it away like it burned his hands. What do you want, Morel, applause? I smiled faintly. Nothing. I already have the building. His mouth tightened, and for a second I thought he might lash out, but instead he stood. You used our name, he said, gesturing vaguely to the crest on the letterhead. I used his, I corrected. Harlan's, the only Hanford who ever looked at me and saw more than disobedience. My father paused. That name landed heavier than I expected. Grandfather Harlan had been a mythic figure in his own right. Stoic, but kind, practical, yet warm. And he'd believed in me quietly, even when everyone else assumed I'd become a cautionary tale. I can't believe this, my father muttered. You hid all this. You manipulated your way in. No, I said calmly. I engineered my way in. There's a difference. He stared at me, and then, without another word, he turned and walked out. No door slam, no raised voice, just the sound of his polished shoes on the hardwood floor fading into the hallway. I sat there a while after he left, letting the silence settle again. This time, I wasn't a daughter begging to be heard. I was the architect of the very ground he stood on, and he couldn't bear the weight of it. 3 days after my father walked out of the Langmore, I sat at my kitchen counter with a mug of black coffee and opened the dashboard to the Harlan Fund's administrative portal. The room was still quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the azaleas were just beginning to bloom a southern spring, unfolding in slow motion. It was the kind of morning that made silence feel like armor. I logged in and clicked through the accounts. First up, the automatic healthcare disbursement set to St. Joseph's Hospital under a general patient grant stream. It covered my mother's neurology visits, specialist medications, and home equipment. The system had always used a randomized code and a neutral trust entity. No name, no direct trail, but I knew. And now it was time. I clicked Pause Disbursement. Then I redirected the remaining funds to a publicly available regional health foundation. The money would still help someone, just not people who refused to acknowledge the hands behind it. Next, the maintenance grant for the Hanford historical home, their pride and patriotism shrine in the Charleston suburbs. The monthly stipend paid for utilities preservation security. I reviewed the clause sustained in the interest of legacy stewardship and shook my head. Legacy. That word had teeth. I terminated the contract. Click. Confirm. Done. The last transfer had been for my brother Gavin's business debt. He didn't know it, of course. His latest consulting firm had quietly missed a payroll quarter, and an anonymous donor had paid the tax penalty to avoid liens. That donor had been me through a dummy foundation that existed for exactly that kind of rescue. A final courtesy for the sibling who once called me the girl who designs air vents. I shut it down, closed the loop. No notice, no warning, just the end of the silent pipeline that had kept their foundations from cracking. Then I drafted a note. Simple, precise, no venom, just truth. To the Hanfords. You made it clear that I no longer exist in your world. That's your right. But people who see me as dead can't keep living off my name. Morel, I printed a single, hard copy. No email, no text, no trail to argue with or misunderstand. I folded it, slipped it into a plain envelope, and mailed it to their address. No return name. But they'd know. The point wasn't vengeance, it was clarity. For years I had let myself believe that providing in silence was a way to stay tethered, that helping them even anonymously was some higher form of love. I told myself it was grace. Maybe even a kind of peace offering. But the truth was, I was funding a fiction. feeding a structure that treated me as a footnote. And I was done. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the back porch watching the moon rise above the marsh. The house was quiet. The Langmore was mine, the inheritance of labor, of resilience, of choices they never honored. I held it all in my name now, fully, finally, not to throw in their faces, but to remind myself I had always been enough. They just couldn't see it. And now, they didn't have access to it either. The Langmore's 9th floor had always been reserved for private events and special guests, corporate retreats, exclusive receptions visiting dignitaries who wanted something discreet and luxurious. It had never hosted offices. Until now. The morning sunlight filtered through tall arched windows as I stepped into what had once been the ambassador suite. Now, it bore the beginnings of something new, the Savannah branch of Craft Habitat. My firm, my name. No shell companies, no anonymous trust trails, just me standing in the middle of the room with blueprints unrolled across the central conference table and a sign taped to the door that read, Site Office Dr. Morel Hanford. A crew of 6 had flown in from Denver the day before, and 3 more from Asheville were arriving by week's end. Some were longtime collaborators, others young engineers who had joined the firm during its rapid growth. When I announced the new expansion, they didn't ask for relocation bonuses or question the leap. They raised their hands and said, We're in. Claire, my project coordinator from Colorado, walked in carrying 2 coffees and an overstuffed manila folder. Permits are stamped, she said, handing one of the cups to me, and the city council rep loved the sustainability angle. I smiled, flipping through the paperwork. The ink was still fresh on the permit approval for the Riverlight Development Savannah's first fully solar-integrated waterfront project. A blend of retail, residential, and green space built around flood-conscious engineering and walkable design. Something permanent, something restorative. That's ours now, I said, tapping the seal at the bottom of the form. First signature with my name. No layers, no aliases. Claire nodded her eyes, scanning the views outside. You're really doing it. I looked out too. From the 9th floor, the city stretched in a quilt of rooftops, treetops, and threads of marshland. You could almost trace history from up here, the old bones of a Confederate city trying to become something more honest, something cleaner, more just. It felt fitting. A new foundation built on a place that had once excluded me. I thought back to when I was 23 and had consulted quietly through another company on this very hotel's HVAC redesign. I hadn't been allowed to sign anything back then. Everything funneled through more experienced male colleagues, through firms with clout and names that didn't sound young and hopeful, but I'd laid the pipework, drawn the systems, done the math. The Langmore's entire cooling efficiency relied on the modular system I'd designed from a drafty studio behind an art teacher's home. And now I held the deed to the roof above us. Team meeting in 10, Claire said, glancing at her watch. Everyone's in the lounge. I stayed back for a second after she left. Let the stillness settle. I walked to the far wall where sunlight poured through a series of paneled windows and touched the fresh coat of paint. The trim was still the original wood hand-carved nearly a century ago. The room smelled like lemon oil and clean drywall. I pulled a small plaque from my bag and pressed it gently against the doorframe with a strip of mounting tape. It was simple brushed steel engraved with a single name, Dr. Morel Hanford, founder, engineer, principal. There. No hiding, no initials, no shielding behind companies named for old men, no more building from the shadows. Down the hallway, voices began to rise, laughter, the shuffle of chairs, someone clicking through a slideshow. My team, my people. I felt my chest rise with a quiet kind of pride, the kind that doesn't need applause, just presence. Before heading out to join them, I paused one last time and looked at the floor beneath my feet. This building had been the site of my humiliation, my erasure, a place where my father's words had cut cleaner than any blade. But now, this floor carried the weight of something else entirely, my work, my vision, my permanence. And beneath that concrete I once mapped out, steel beams I once calculated. Turns out, I'd been holding the structure together for years. I just hadn't claimed the view until now. The knock came just after 10 on a Thursday morning, soft and hesitant, Not the kind of sound that traveled well across the thick lounge doors of the Langmore. But I heard it anyway, maybe because the quiet that morning had its own kind of weight, the kind that lets even a breath feel loud. I'd been reviewing early sketches for the Riverlight Welcome Center, a low-profile glass pavilion meant to mirror the riverbank, with its lines not dominate it. Sunlight poured through the cafe windows behind me, and the smell of toasted rye and espresso drifted lazily from the counter. When I opened the door, my mother stood there, gloved hands holding the strap of her handbag like it was the only thing anchoring her to the floor. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, she'd always been petite, but in presence. She used to walk into rooms like she'd co-written the script. Now she paused on the threshold as if waiting for stage direction. "Can I sit?" she asked. I nodded once and motioned toward the table where I'd left my notes. She walked in slowly, scanning the lounge the way you do when visiting a place you're not sure you're welcome in. She didn't ask if she was intruding. She already knew she was. When she finally sat, she placed her bag gently in her lap and folded her hands over it. Her nails were short now, no polish. A small tremor rippled through one thumb as it rested on the other. "I'm not here to beg," she said, "and I'm not here to defend your father." I didn't respond. Not out of malice, just restraint. For a moment, the clink of a coffee cup from across the lounge filled the silence between us. I saw the press release. She continued, eyes steady. It took me a few days to understand it was you, Harlan Holdings, Craft Habitat, all of it. Still, I said nothing. The proof had never been for them. I'd spent too many years laying bricks beneath their radar. She inhaled softly, voice growing more uncertain. "I thought your career was, what did he say, small? Private sector, niche nonsense." I repeated it. I believed it. My mother had never raised her voice at me, but silence was her weapon of choice, long, cold stretches of absence when I didn't meet expectations. Her disapproval never had to be shouted. It lived in pauses, in the way she set plates without a place for me, in the way she answered other people's questions about her children by saying, "My son's a captain in logistics and nothing more." "I was wrong," she said, not dramatically, not with tears. Just a quiet confession in a room with no audience. "I never thought I'd learn anything from you, but I was wrong." A breeze shifted through the open window near the back wall. I watched it ruffle the edge of my blueprint roll and took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. Part of me expected her to ask something next. Money helped some gesture that softened her pride, but she didn't. Instead, she pulled something from her bag, a photo worn at the edges of me and Grandpa Harlan. I was 12. He had his arm around my shoulders, and I was pointing at something out of frame, probably a bird, knowing how often he took me to watch the marsh. "He believed in you," she said, placing the photo on the table. "We both should have." It wasn't an apology. Not quite, but it wasn't nothing either. I reached forward and slid the photo toward me. My fingers brushed the corner of the paper. Then I looked up, meeting her gaze fully for the first time in years. "I'm not here to rewrite anything I said. Not looking for vindication, or for some emotional reunion. I know. But I won't erase what I've built just to fit back into a place that never wanted me." She gave a slow nod, almost like she'd rehearsed it. "I didn't come expecting to be let in. I just wanted to show up." That line, "I just wanted to show up," landed heavier than anything else. Because that's what I'd wanted my whole life, for her to show up, to claim me, to name what I was building as real, as valuable, as worthy. She stood a minute later, tucking her hands back around her bag. "If there's ever a next time," she said, "I'll ask first." I didn't hug her. She didn't reach for one. But as she turned to leave, I watched her walk out of the lounge, without hesitation, shoulders a little straighter than when she'd entered. That morning didn't fix anything, but it marked something. A knock, a seat at the table, a truth spoken aloud. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's a beginning. The mic was heavier than it looked, or maybe my hand just felt too aware of itself. The Hilton ballroom wasn't big, but the folding chairs had filled up fast. Local university faculty, early career engineers, a few high school girls in wide-eyed awe sitting in the back with plastic name tags clipped to blazers they'd clearly borrowed. Someone had arranged delicate roses in glass jars along the windowsills, and a banner overhead read, Southern Women in Structural Innovation Building the Future from the Ground Up. I wasn't supposed to speak last. I wasn't even on the original schedule. But when the keynote couldn't fly in from Raleigh, the organizers asked if I'd fill the spot. Nothing formal, they said. Just share your story. Tell them what they won't hear in textbooks. The thing is, I had never told this story out loud. Not the way it really happened, not to anyone who hadn't lived some version of it. I looked out over the audience, resting my hand briefly on the wood lectern. My notes were there, but I didn't glance at them. Instead, I took a breath that stretched down into my ribs and began. I grew up with a blueprint for my life, I said. Except I didn't draw it. A few smiles flickered, familiar nods. Good start. In my family, there were written rules: clean your room, stand up straight, shake hands with eye contact. And then there were unwritten rules: don't interrupt men, don't outshine your brother, and for the love of God, don't try to build something they didn't ask for. That got a low ripple of knowing laughter from the middle rows. I wanted to be an architect when I was 12. I thought buildings could be more than just walls. I liked the idea of structures that breathed glass, that filtered heat plumbing, that recycled gray water foundations made to bend with storms instead of snap against them. I let that settle for a second. But according to my dad, that was soft nonsense. He was a retired colonel, 3 generations of military service before him. Where I came from, there were only 2 acceptable futures: West Point or disappointment. I chose disappointment, at least to them. My voice didn't waver. Not yet. But I could feel the weight shifting in the room, people leaning forward, the rustle of sleeves as women crossed and uncrossed their arms. When I was 18, I left, rented a garage studio behind an art teacher's house, and took a scholarship at a university no one in my family could pronounce. I worked 3 jobs. I designed HVAC systems for eco-lodges in Colorado before I ever had my own thermostat. More nods now. Some women were jotting notes, others weren't blinking. I steadied my grip on the microphone. Years later, I was invited to a formal family dinner at a historic hotel. I'd just closed a quiet deal, nothing flashy, nothing loud, but it mattered. I was ready to tell them what I'd built, what I owned, who I had become. I paused. This part was the risk. This was the cliff I hadn't stepped off in public before. But before I could speak, I said slowly, my father stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Leave now. You're dead to me." The words floated over the ballroom like someone had cracked a pane of glass. For a few seconds, you could hear nothing at all. I didn't flinch, just stared straight ahead, voice clear. And for a long time, I let that line define me. It echoed in every empty voicemail, every contract I signed anonymously, every ribbon I cut while someone else took credit. I let silence be the currency of survival. Then I smiled. Not bitterly, not triumphantly, just honestly. But I realize now it might have been the best thing he ever said to me. A few eyebrows lifted. A woman in the front row dropped her pen. Because when he said those words, I continued, something else opened up. Not a wound. A doorway. I shifted the mic to my other hand, taking a slow breath. It made me start building something that finally felt alive. The room was still. Not a phone, not a whisper, just the sound of women sitting with what it meant to be made small, then daring to grow anyway. And now, I said, I don't build for their recognition. I build for permanence, for presence, for women who are told their names don't belong on deeds or blueprints or brass plaques above hotel doors. I set the mic down, gently, the last sentence humming in the air like the final chord of a hymn. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the applause rose, not loud, but layered, like an exhale, like acknowledgement, like something held too long had just been let go. I didn't bow. I didn't wave. I just stepped down and walked back to my seat, heart steady, shoulders high. The story was no longer hidden, and neither was I. Sunday nights belonged to the rooftop now. The Langmore's top terrace, once reserved for exclusive wedding parties and boardroom cocktail hours, had become something else, something quieter, warmer, more alive. String lights stretched from beam to beam, swaying slightly in the breeze. Mismatched chairs circled reclaimed wood tables. Herbs grew from old planters. bread passed hand to hand. Morel stood near the railing watching her team settle in young engineers, designers, interns. Some fresh from school, some hardened by years of being overlooked. All of them chosen, not because of legacy, but because of grit. She joined them as someone popped open a second bottle of wine and someone else slid a plate of roasted vegetables her way. Conversation danced across the table, design ideas, jokes about failed prototypes, a side debate over compostable concrete. No one asked for permission to speak. Everyone was heard. A new intern, maybe. 22, asked the question gently. What made you come back? Morel paused, tore a piece of bread, then looked out over the savannah skyline. The Langmore's rooftop gave the best view spires and trees and the edge of the river. I used to think I had to outrun everything that made me, she said. But it turns out, you don't have to reclaim a past that tried to erase you. She looked around the table faces, lit by the glow of string lights and moonlight. I didn't repair the foundation, she said. I built over it, stronger, freer. Mine. They listened. And then, as always, someone raised a glass. To new ground. Later, after everyone left and the dishes were stacked neatly by the kitchen door, Morel walked alone through the quiet halls, past the elevator, past the portraits of hotel founders and ribbon cuttings, toward the ballroom. The plaque was simple brass and clean mounted next to the doors that once shut her out. The Harlan Room, for those who built in silence. She rested her hand on the cool metal, closed her eyes for a moment. Then she turned her heels soft against the carpet and walked back toward the light.